Good evening. Welcome back. Hope all is well on the internets tonight. Well, today we're going to look at psychology, Unit 2, biological basis of behavior, and we're going to start with a curious case of Phineas Gage, which is a good example of how accidents happen and sometimes we learn quite a lot from them. So, Phineas Gage is a person that you may be familiar with, but maybe not. In some biology classes, they'll focus on him, or anatomy classes. In our classroom, his portrait or picture there that the kids in this class are holding is up on the wall, kind of above my desk, and he's been sort of winking at you all this time that you've been in the classroom, and maybe you haven't noticed, but he's noticed you. So let's learn a little bit more about this guy named Phineas Gage. I'm going to tell the story pretty quickly, but I think the best person to tell the story is this link right here. So within the notes, I would definitely click on this and hear Hank Green explain it. But Phineas Gage basically was a guy who had a metal tamping rod enter below his socket of his eye and go up through the top of his head and exit, and it went through very, very fast. He was a worker on a railroad construction site, and this is 1823 to 1860, so sometime in the 1850s or late 1840s is when this happened, and it's a good example for physicians, doctors, and scientists to look at to see what happens if the brain suffers a very dramatic injury. What are the results of that injury, and what can we learn from that? And could a person survive this? Well, he does survive this. He's remembered for this improbable survival of the accident, which it went completely through his head. Now, what's going to happen to him after he survives this? Is he going to have the ability to speak? Will he have, issues with memory? The types of problems he's going to have might try to explain to us then, looking at this, maybe that part of the brain is going to control certain functions. And so that's what they find out and learn from here. But much of the left frontal lobe was destroyed. And as we'll find out right here, you've actually got two kind of frontal lobes right across the front of your head. They're right here. And they're very important for decision making, for planning, also to execute like an executive order or to make a decision. And sometimes when they're damaged, you might be very impulsive, quick to make judgments, difficult with time management. Those kinds of problems might be had. So the reported effects on Mr. Phineas Gage were definitely personality based and behaviorally based. And we've looked at personality some. What basically his friends said about him over the next 12 years, which he survived, it was kind of an amazing recovery, is that his friends reported that they saw him as no longer being Gage, no longer being himself. Excuse me. So his personality was radically different. He would be prone to swearing and cursing and cussing. He would miss work from time to time because he wasn't able to plan ahead to get up and to be at work. He ended up being a stagecoach driver in Chile, which is an interesting job, but he bounced around quite a bit and even spent some time in a circus. And I think that's where the pictures were taking with him with the tamping rod. And how did this happen? Well, he was using the tamping rod to pack dynamite. And when you do that and you're packing it down in there, you have to have a filler over the hole. And if you don't, well, then you're going to hit the dynamite. And that's what happened to him essentially. And I guess he was kind of lucky that it didn't go through major portions of his brain. Like, he could survive this injury, though most people were kind of shocked to hear that he did. And when he was first seen by the doctors, and he wasn't unconscious at first, he said that he hoped he wasn't hurt much. But then he went into a coma that lasted for a while. And when he recovered and woke from the coma, and they did some surgery, I guess, to stitch up or fix his face, or the skin grew, I think he always sort of had like an indentation in his head there. You can tell where the skull was fractured. His skull, his actual skull, and the tamping rod are in a museum somewhere. I can't remember which museum, but he used to be a nice guy until he took an iron rod to the left frontal lobe. So I don't recommend that. But what it teaches us is that personality does not come from the heart or the stomach or something down here. It comes from the mind, and what we're going to find out in this unit, the biological basis of behavior, is that although some people may feel like, there's a body and a soul, and those are two different things, or your mind and the way it thinks is separate from your body. And we say things like this all the time, like, oh, my arm and my leg, almost like they're detached from our mind, like you have ownership over those things, not that they're just part of your body. It might be a subtle change of the way we emphasize English and the way we describe things, but many people kind of look at life, and you might look at the afterlife as well, like what happens to the physical body after you are dead. Does the soul go to heaven? If you believe that, then you are essentially a dualist, somebody who believes in both the mind and body being separate, because how could it be otherwise if you believe that the mind and the body were one? Because once the body died, then the soul or the mind would die as well. So you have to kind of like separate sometimes belief from science there when you're looking at just the science part of it, because it's a little bit confusing, and there's only so much proof we have. Obviously there's belief and then there's scientific proof, but the other big breakthrough with this is that we can operate on the brain, and that people could actually survive a brain operation. They're not operating on his brain here, essentially. They probably could have gone in and done that. He reportedly had coughed when he was with the doctor, which I can imagine after having a rod go through your head, you might cough. And the doctor reported that he had lost several teacups of brain in the process, which seems to be a few more teacups than you would want to lose of brain. We don't use teacups anymore to like measure things, but still I think that's too much brain to lose. And these are all like in the doctor's notes. And the doctor, I think at that point was thinking there's no way he's going to survive. How can someone survive an injury like this to the brain? Well, it's very possible. And this is a famous example used by medical research to say, well, if someone like this could survive this kind of injury, if there's another injury to the head, then if you opened up the brain, you might be able to work on the skull or the brain to help someone. This is the Nova video, Nova Now. I'm not going to play it, but you can click on it, and it kind of animates it and tells you a few facts about this guy. So what are we going to need to know at the end of this for the biological basis of behavior? And this is like part one of the unit. The second part is sensation and perception. So the different methods for peering into the human brain, and those are different things like the CAT scan, the PET scan, the functional MRIs, those types of things. We'll look at each one of those and see what the different methodology is. Like, why would you use certain techniques and certain technologies to see different kinds of things within the brain? And what areas of control are in the mind, and what does the brain do, and what functions does it have? Within the brain and within your body are billions and billions and billions of neurons. So we're definitely going to study the neuron. It works on what's called an action potential, and it works a whole lot like the firing of a gun. You pull the trigger on a gun, it's either going to not fire, or you reach a certain point of no return, and then the gun fires. And that's sort of how the neuron functions when it sends its signal. So the role of neurotransmitters in neural transmission is super important. So we're going to look at that some. And I know we've had an article that talked about neurotransmitters and GABA and those types of things. Well, we're going to get a chance to see how that actually works in this unit. One thing I want to kind of temper this with and warn you about is, although this can seem like really, really complicated and tons of anatomy and those sorts of things, and you can kind of get frustrated with, wow, I don't know this very much. Some of you may know it very well because maybe this is something that you're familiar with bio or some other classes that you've had with anatomy and physiology. But what I can tell you is we're going to try to make it relatable as possible, so you have some context to place all this in. We'll learn the parts of the brain, for example, but not just, hey, these are the parts of the brain, but what do those parts do and what are their functions? What happens if there's disease or dysfunction or injury or whatever to that area? What would happen to a person? So hopefully with that kind of context, it'll make this a little bit easier for you. So neurons, they're the individual cells of the nervous system that receive, integrate, and transmit information. And they're just like, they're like the atoms in some way of the chemistry world. I mean, the neurons in biology are where it's all at. Now, that's what we know of today. We think the smallest thing that's going on there is the neuron and parts within the neuron. But, brain science and science in general is always learning some new things. But for right now, we know that they're the basic links that communicate with the nervous system. And it's made up of the soma, or the cell body, which you see down there at the bottom, the cell's life support center. So it's like the body of the cell. That has a nucleus. You can kind of see the nucleus here in the center of that body cell. And much of the cell's normal organs are all included in there. The dendrites are the parts that receive information. You can see the little branches that go off and receive messages from other cells. The axon is sometimes very long fibers. These can be a foot long, sometimes from your spinal cord all the way to a finger or toe. I mean, these are really long axons that transmit information away to other neurons and muscles and glands. The myelin sheath is that insulation that goes around and encases some axons. And I say some because there's the Ranvier nodes that are like gaps between them, and sometimes those even actually help to speed up the transmission in a strange way. We will talk about all of this and the terminal branches of the axon, which form junctions to other cells, which aren't like we used to think not so long ago. We used to think that all these neurons were connected. Now we know that there's a little tiny space between them now where there's a chemical burst that goes between them. That's the communication. So it's kind of interesting how much we're learning every day about the body and these very small units. And as someone who suffers from a disease that deals with neurons and axons and myelin sheath and all this sort of thing, with MS we'll be studying this quite a lot too, because it affects my central nervous system and brain. That's the orange part here on the right. So the orange is the brain, and then down the central nervous system. Makes sense. That is in the nervous system, the main corridor, the main functioning superhighway, I guess you'd call it. And then all the exit roads that lead back to this are your peripheral nervous system. So nerves are bundles of neuron fibers, axons, that are routed together in the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is made up of all those nerves that lie outside the brain and spinal cord, and the somatic nervous system is made up of the nerves that connect to voluntary skeletal muscles and to sensory receptors. Remember, you need to write these down. You can always pause it and rewind and stop as you need to, because I'm not going to just sit here and wait. But please pause it when you need to. Write something down or jot something down or draw a diagram, which is something I really recommend you doing as you go through your notes, is drawing these diagrams out, especially the last one here, which is one that we're going to return to later. This is kind of a quick overview, so don't feel like I'm going too fast. I'm just kind of introducing it, and then we're going to have notes and a video presentation on just the neuron and just the nervous system, and then we'll have one. You see the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems there as well, and then we'll have a presentation on the brain itself. We're building from the smallest parts to the biggest part, and we'll even do that within the brain. We'll handle the earliest parts of the brain and what they sometimes call the reptilian brain, to what we consider today be the brain, the main brain, and the cerebral cortex, which is more, I guess, the mammalian brain. But biological basic behavior, at the bottom there, looking inside a brain, you can see with an MRI that a healthy brain on the left has no white lesion spots in the middle. And this one on the right, the plaques it shows. This is the one on the left, and the one on the right shows a few plaques, and those are similar to what I have in my brain. Maybe not as pronounced, and I'm kind of lucky that way so far. But the center area, this corpus callosum, is where I have some of my lesions. So we'll talk about that as we go. But there's a lot of innovation happening with brain imaging and electrical recording, or EEGs, the device that monitors the electrical activity of the brain over time. You attach electrodes to the scalp, and I've had this done when I was first being diagnosed. Lesioning is destroying pieces of the brain and observing the effects, and this is mostly done on animals, and we'll definitely see this later on when we talk motivation. The motivation unit, and that's part of another unit coming down the road. We'll look at, like, why do humans or animals eat, what motivates them to eat, and can you change that by going into the brain and lesioning or destroying certain parts of the brain. And we found out that you can, but it's also pretty complicated, not as easy as it might seem. The hypothalamus, lateral hypothalamus, has to do with that area. The ESB is the electrical stimulation of the brain, and this is very interesting, where you can stimulate the brain while you're doing surgery, and parts of the body will move and react, or the patient will hear sounds that aren't there. It's really interesting. So, I mean, what are we? And some people might say we're just a bag of neurons that are stimulating or not stimulating, or sending signals or receiving signals. Others might say we're more than just that, but transcranial magnetic stimulation, the TMS, is a technique using magnets that permits scientists to temporarily enhance or activate parts of the brain or depress activity in certain areas of the brain. We will see this when we talk about the savants. And there's a researcher in Australia who does this by putting the magnets on one side of the head only to temporarily kind of paralyze that side of the brain, so the other side of the brain takes over. And he is thinking that that might be why some people exhibit savant-like characteristics or genius characteristics. And wouldn't it be neat if we could just kind of put on, in a way, like a thinking cap? We'll put this on, it paralyzes one side of my brain, or at least slows it down, and the other side gets activated, and bingo, I am an artist or a singer or whatever. And we're nowhere near doing that yet, but it's interesting what they are seeing already when they do these types of experiments. So brain imaging, the CTs, the PETs, the MRIs, these are the types of scans that give scientists an imaging of the brain. And each one has kind of weaknesses, things that it doesn't show and things that it definitely does show. So, you know, if you gave somebody a CT scan, you wouldn't be able to see the things that you're seeing here on the left side with, on the left picture at the bottom, with the inside of the brain and the plaques. So, a real quick overview here of the human nervous system. The brain, part of the nervous system. You get your hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain, and these are the different building areas that we're going to see with the brain as we build them out. The spinal cord, of course, somatic nervous system, autonomic nervous system, more involuntary kind. Here's your two lobes of the brain down there on the left, and then the center is what's called the corpus callosum. In a way, if you're lying down, it sort of makes a C like that. It's really a super highway of fibers that connect both sides of the brain. We'll also learn about a savant, Kim Peek, who had damage to this area of his brain. So instead of having a corpus callosum that sent information back and forth to both sides of his brain, he just had one brain that functioned in ways that most other humans have never functioned before. Instead of the right brain, left brain doing what it does, his whole brain functioned that way. And he had an amazing ability to be able to read a book by reading the right side or the right page with his right eye, and the left side or the left page with his left eye, and read them both at the same time, which just seems to be impossible. But it's impossible for us to imagine because we have a corpus callosum that kind of separates these things out and communicates left and right brain activity. He did not have that. After they put him through MRIs and checked it and looked at it, they were pretty shocked to see what was going on inside of his brain. A very special brain. Of course, he didn't have the ability to dress himself, but he could memorize almost entire volumes of books, music, and he was pretty impressive in so many other ways. So the brain develops from the back to the front, and it's always kind of being reorganized, but it's really being reorganized under teenage situations. Until you're about 25 years old, the brain hasn't fully developed yet. And so where is it not fully developed? Mostly in the frontal lobe, and that area is where we see decision making. Your temporal lobes are along the side. Okay, I always say that's where girls will push their hair back behind their ears temporarily. It says right here. And then you've got your parietal lobe, which is sort of towards the back. The occipital lobe in the very back. And the primary visual cortex is located in there. And that's where you see. Now, I know you use your eyes, but the eyes are taking light and focusing it in there. Neurons are firing, and it's the back of the brain that's helping you see images. If there's injury to the back of the brain, you could have temporary blindness or see things very, very differently than you used to. So we've got the quick overview of what we'll learn. We'll continue with this. At the bottom, you'll get a little clue here as to where we're going. It's the endocrine system. So it consists of glands that secrete chemicals into the bloodstream to help us control bodily functioning. They play a very important role, but maybe not as important as what some of your parents will say. They'll say, oh, teenagers and hormones. Yeah, there's some hormonal differences with teenagers and adults, but I think the biggest thing that's different is the fact that your brain is weeding out or going through the process of kind of destroying connections in your brain so that it can strengthen the ones you need the most. And that process is where you see a teenager who is going through difficult times because there's confusion, uncertainty, difficulty planning. And as we mentioned, the frontal lobes are the ones that finish the last part of development. So hormones travel though throughout the body, and they travel much slower than neurotransmitters, which are like lightning fast. Hormones are almost, in a way, I envision them like as liquids kind of flowing through the body. And it's not that, but it just seems like that. Like if you poured water over you, it would kind of slowly drip down through. And the electrical impulse is like lightning. You don't want to mix both, I guess, but a lightning strike compared to the flow of a stream is a little different process here. So they regulate many physical and behavioral functions, and they're super important, and we're going to learn lots about hormones. But the pituitary gland is another pretty important thing. It's based in the hypothalamus, which is sort of like your regulatory control of the brain. The pituitary gland also releases hormones into the body, but the endocrine system is in charge of adrenaline and the adrenaline effect, which we'll study in Fight versus Flight. We'll also study heredity and behavior and behavioral genetics, and this is a growing field. Since we have been able to decode the genome, which means that we understand the genes that make up a human. We had them all kind of decoded and understood. We don't have them fully understood to the point where we can make a human, but we're getting pretty close to knowing the factors that make up disease, like certain parts of your genetic code. If you get it analyzed, you may say, well, your ancestors. Now, I know this is true for some people. They've been getting testing for breast cancer, and if they show to have certain genetic characteristics of their parents, some women are choosing to get treatment even before they have breast cancer because they think the odds are so strongly against them to get breast cancer that they wanted to take kind of a preemptive action. So the basic principles of genetics we'll study. We'll look at chromosomes, the strands of DNA that carry that genetic information. We'll study the zygote, which is the single cell that's formed by the union of the sperm and the egg. And we'll also see that in development, of course, for certain, when we look at the development of the fetus and the growth of a human being from the beginning all the way through the end of life. and genes, of course, which carry those DNA segments, and they serve as key units in heredity and hereditary transition. So you are who you are, but who your relatives were kind of passed along through you, and we'll study how that works. And that's a bit of nature versus nurture too, which we've been looking at in the last week or so in class. Here are some video clips here at the end to maybe get your brain going. Obviously, you can't click on these within the YouTube video that I'm showing you, but these are on the notes on the website. So go to the notes clip or the notes tab, and then you'll be able to see these. First is the Phineas Gage song by Hank Green, and you've got Hank on the left there at the top and John Green on the right, and these two brothers kind of send video messages back and forth, and Hank came up with a song for Phineas Gage, and that song's right here. Remember, he had the description of him too, which is pretty good. And then there's Psychology 101, which is an educationportal.com website video. These are pretty decent. Some of them are great. Some of them are okay. But if you're having trouble learning something, this is another good place to go to kind of have it cemented. And I really like this one called The Parts of the Brain, which we'll probably see this one in class. Neuroplasticity, something I'm a fan of, how the brain can rewire itself, so to speak, and also recover from injury. We used to think that neurons, once they were damaged or dead, can no longer be recovered or grow back. And we know now that that isn't true, that you can actually grow back and have neurons recover in some certain situations. So that's it for a quick introduction into biology, and this is our unit called Biological Bases of Behavior. And so the last thing I'll say is that that's very important. Not just that we're studying the biology of things, but that we see how the biology impacts human behavior. And there are certain patterns that we're going to be looking for, that if you are someone working in the psychological field of counseling, or psychiatrist, or even school counselor, that you'd know, hey, if somebody suffers a head injury to this part of the brain, maybe they're going to exhibit these kinds of symptoms, and that's just one example. So hopefully this will help you get interested in looking through this unit. Remember, look at the target sheet, which will help you kind of keep track of what it is you specifically need to know and focus in on. Reading the textbook, and we'll look at Psych Trek some. All of these things are pretty helpful to help you out and get you going. So new unit, new chance to get our engines revving again. So we'll see more of you next time. Thanks a lot. Don't forget to be awesome.